There is a woman most people have never truly seen, and the reason is simple: a song got in the way. Fans heard her name, built a picture in their heads, and decided they already knew her story. What they built was a fairy tale set against Colorado mountains, a warm fire, and a man with a guitar who loved her without condition. What they never built into that picture was a chainsaw pressed against a bed. What never made it into the romance was a cord wrapped around her neck in a fit of rage. Annie Martel did not ask to become a symbol, and she spent 15 years inside a marriage that slowly emptied her out while the world watched from the outside and called it beautiful. For 25 years after John Denver died, she said nothing about what really happened. Not one word. People assumed grief. People assumed forgiveness. People assumed there was simply nothing left to say. All of them were wrong. And when she finally spoke in October 2022, the story she told was not the one anyone had prepared themselves to hear. Annie Martel arrived in the world on September 6, 1946, in Nicollet, Minnesota, a farming town where 1,200 people shared the same flat horizon and the same steady way of doing things. Her parents, Jim and Norma, raised 4 children including Annie, Linda, Terry, and Ben, in a home built on routine. Church on Sundays, meals at the table, chores before anything else, and very little tolerance for chaos. None of that was special or memorable in the way that later events would be. It was simply the structure that shaped her, and the shape it gave her ran deep. From early on, Annie positioned herself as the observer in any room she entered, the one who noticed when tension crept into a conversation before a word was spoken, the one who absorbed and kept quiet rather than performed and sought attention. Those instincts protected her family then, and years later they would help her survive a marriage that swung between genuine love and something far more frightening. But the same habits that made her an anchor for others also made it easy for her to shrink when she should have stood firm, to carry weight that belonged to someone else, to stay long after staying made sense. School gave her nothing that disrupted that self-image. Teachers appreciated her steadiness, but nobody pulled her aside to tell her she was exceptional. No trophies carried her name, no leading roles in school productions, no hallway moment where the crowd parted and looked her way. By the time high school ended, she had a very specific idea of what she was, and the word she would have used was ordinary. In 1964, she enrolled at Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota, a small liberal arts school where running into someone familiar was unavoidable most days. Art education suited her quiet nature, and she settled into a routine that matched her personality, attending classes, spending time with friends, never once trying to fill more space than she needed. That version of Annie, comfortable and invisible and unhurried, was the one who walked into a campus performance in the fall of 1966 wearing blue jeans and a flannel shirt, carrying no expectation that the evening would mean anything at all. The performer that night was still going by Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., touring with the Chad Mitchell Trio through college venues across the country. John Denver, as he would eventually be known to millions of people, spotted Annie in that audience and later said the feeling hit him immediately. After the show, he found her and they talked, and for him the conversation stuck in a way that few encounters do. For Annie, he was simply Henry, a singer passing through on his way to the next town, and after they exchanged contact details, he left. But the distance between them did not do what distance usually does to brief connections. John began writing letters, real handwritten letters full of feelings and ambitions, and the kind of honesty that comes more easily on paper than in person. Annie wrote back. Their relationship built itself slowly through those pages and through phone calls, through vulnerability exchanged across miles before anyone had decided what the relationship even was. She later said those early letters mattered more than almost anything that came afterward, because they held who both of them were before fame arrived and changed the conditions entirely. When they reunited in person months later, that foundation made the bond feel natural and inevitable, and by 1967, he had proposed. June 9th, 1967 was their wedding date in St. Peter, and shortly after they moved to Aspen, Colorado, a place that would hold every important chapter of both their lives, the best ones and the ones that nearly destroyed her. Early life in Aspen carried none of the glamour that the John Denver name would later suggest. Money was tight and the pressure was constant, because John had not yet broken through in any lasting way. He played small clubs and coffee houses, chased bookings wherever they appeared, and sometimes slept in his car between shows just to make the schedule work. Back in Aspen, Annie became the steady base that made it possible for him to keep chasing. She cooked and tracked the bills and stretched whatever money came in, sometimes taking outside work to cover what his income could not. Mountain life had been a genuine adjustment for a woman raised on the flat, open land of rural Minnesota. But she adapted by building something real inside the community, joining local activities, volunteering, making friends through shared interests rather than through any connection to his career. That life, rooted and honest and tied to the land, became the truest version of herself she had ever known. And that version of her life would slowly be dismantled as his world expanded and hers stayed exactly where it was. Rocky Mountain High changed everything when it started connecting with mass audiences around 1971, and with that shift came a schedule that left almost no room for the life they had built together. Television appearances, concert tours, recording sessions, and promotional obligations filled every available space, which meant John was almost always somewhere else. Annie described those years, in the rare moments she spoke about them, as deeply lonely in a way that words struggle to capture. Watching someone you love become a superstar while you stay home folding laundry is its own particular kind of grief, and she lived inside that grief for years. The distance between them stopped being just physical somewhere in that stretch of time and became something else, something quieter and harder to name. A question settled into her during those years and refused to leave. The question of how she was supposed to compete with arenas full of people who adored him. She had no answer. The question stayed. One of the wounds from the early years of marriage had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with something deeply private. Annie and John wanted biological children, and that door stayed closed to them. Adoption became the path forward, and in 1974 they welcomed a son named Zachary John, followed 2 years later by a daughter named Anna Kate. Those children gave Annie something that no amount of concert success or public recognition could have offered, a real and grounded purpose that belonged entirely to her and not to his career or his image. She built their life in Aspen with everything she had, protecting that family space from the noise outside it. John spoke openly and often about how much fatherhood meant to him, and more than once he said he wanted to be remembered as a father and husband before anything else, not as a musician. And for stretches of time, the family they built around Zachary and Anna Kate made the weight of everything else almost manageable. But almost is the word that mattered, because the cracks in the marriage kept spreading no matter what grew up around them. Rumors reached Annie through people in John's circle, and none of what they told her could be dismissed as idle gossip. Friends and insiders described groupies, late nights, and other women encountered during the long tour stretches away from home, and John himself confirmed the infidelity in his own autobiography, particularly after fame magnified both opportunity and temptation. Annie confronted him, and the pattern that followed was one she would repeat many times over the years. Confrontation met with denial or with promises that dissolved before they had any chance to take hold. People who knew both of them during that period remember watching something drain out of Annie, not all at once, but steadily, the way water leaves through a crack that nobody bothers to fix. She grew tired in a way that sleep could not address, worn down by the constant feeling of competing with a world that loved her husband more than he honored his own commitments. And layered on top of that came something that made the whole situation more dangerous. Alcohol had become a consistent presence in John's life by the late 1970s and into the 1980s, and it changed who he was when he came through the door. Annie later described those nights with a plainness that made them harder to hear, not easier. Shouting, broken glass, emotional eruptions that bore no resemblance to the gentle face on the record covers. Home was no longer a safe place and had not been one for a long time. She lived with fear occupying the same space as love, which is one of the most exhausting combinations a person can carry, and she carried it for years without telling anyone outside the walls of that house. Friends and biographers who later documented this period confirmed what she experienced. Two versions of John Denver existed simultaneously, the one the public celebrated and the one who came home, and they shared very little except a name. Money added its own particular damage. As his wealth grew, so did the gap between them in terms of who held power and who did not. Large decisions about properties, recording investments, and financial arrangements got made without any feeling genuinely part of the conversation. And the result was that she slowly lost the sense of being a partner in her own life. Legal agreements arrived for her to sign, documents that restricted what she could discuss outside the family about their private life, and each signature deepened the isolation. She was living inside a life that strangers envied and idealized while she herself was struggling to find solid ground inside it. The money in the mountains and the beautiful songs about love and sunshine sat on top of a foundation that had been rotting quietly for years. And that's when the chainsaw entered the story. During the final stage of their divorce, John took a chainsaw to the bed they had shared and cut it straight down the middle. And Annie confirmed this in her October 2022 podcast interview. Not as metaphor, but as fact. That was not the only incident involving that tool. Divorce documents referenced, and insiders later recounted a separate moment in which John wrapped a chainsaw cord around Annie's neck during a rage, and those accounts found their way into media coverage and documentary records over the years. For the public, the chainsaw became the image that shattered the John Denver mythology more completely than anything else. For Annie, it was not an image. It was a memory that lived in her body. 15 years of marriage ended in 1982 with court filings that reflected every bit of the chaos that had been building since the mid-1970s, and the divorce was bitter and exhausting and nothing like the way the song sounded. What came after the divorce was, in its own way, the most clarifying period of Annie's life. She stayed in Colorado and built the quietest existence she could manage, focusing everything on protecting Zachary and Anna Kate from the tabloid noise that surrounded their father's name. When she appeared in public, it was rarely and purposefully, always in support of something that mattered rather than in defense of herself. She moved through those post-divorce years with deliberate stillness, the same quality she had carried since childhood, now functioning as armor rather than insecurity. John died on October 12, 1997, when the experimental aircraft he was piloting crashed in a Monterey Bay near Pacific Grove, California, and the world reacted with an outpouring of public grief that was loud and immediate. Annie did not step toward the microphones. She honored him through their children and through quiet attendance at memorials in Aspen. And when she spoke about him in those early years after his death, she focused on the music and its impact rather than anything that had happened between them privately. And then she went essentially silent for more than 2 decades. People filled that silence with their own explanations. Some thought she was guarding his legacy out of residual love. Others assumed time had softened the sharp edges of everything into something easier to hold. The real explanation was simpler and harder than either of those guesses. She was healing. She was waiting until she could speak without the act of speaking tearing her open again. And she was afraid of what truth-telling might do not to his reputation, but to her children. That October 2022 conversation with Emil Rocca on the Mobituaries podcast, in the episode titled John Denver Death of the Sunshine Boy, was the first time she allowed a window to open into what she had actually lived through. She confirmed the chainsaw incidents directly and without drama. She corrected the mythology around Annie's song, the correction that landed hardest for many people who loved that song, explaining that John had not written it from a place of contentment or easy romantic happiness. He wrote it in roughly 10 minutes while riding the Ajax chairlift in Aspen following a serious argument between them, and the speed came not from bliss but from urgency, from a man trying to reach back across the damage he had caused and ask his wife not to give up on them. Knowing that, the song shifts. The melody stays the same, and the words do not change, but the weight underneath them becomes entirely different. Annie said the song felt like a prayer when she first heard it. Not a love letter written from happiness, but an outstretched hand from someone who understood he had caused damage and was asking to be forgiven. Annie Martell Denver, now in her late 70s, lives quietly in Aspen near her children and grandchildren. Interview requests come, and she declines most of them. When she appears publicly, it is to support causes she believes in or to honor John's music in a way that feels honest rather than performative. She has never attempted to erase his legacy or reduce him to the worst things he did. And she has said plainly that the same man who hurt her also wrote songs that became companions for millions of people moving through their own difficult years. She holds both of those truths at once without asking anyone to choose between them. which takes a kind of steadiness that is almost difficult to look at directly. The girl from Nicolette who spent decades feeling invisible, who watched her own identity disappear into the orbit of a famous name, who signed documents that silenced her and stayed quiet for years because the cost of speaking felt too high, eventually reclaimed herself not through any dramatic public moment, but through the slow private work of building a life that actually belonged to her. She chose her silence when it protected her family, and she chose her voice when the time was right, and both of those choices were hers to make. That is not a small thing. For a woman who spent the better part of her adult life feeling like she had no power over her own story, it is everything.